Well, welcome back to Barley and Hops. Yep, I'm George, the channel that dares again to unlock the mysteries of home distilling. Yes. Hey, now we just went through a video, and if you see, I mean, there it is right there. You can go back and watch that. And I've left the board written up, and what we did was we outlined, with sort of like a rule of thumb, based on the size of your still and the element that you use, about how long it takes to heat it up, and kind of why we were able to match the proper element to the proper still, or whatever process that you have. That's really what the whole gist of the video was. So you are armed with an immense amount of information now. So you'll know which element in order to choose in order to make your still work properly. And that's what the purpose of that was. On this video, though, what we intend to do is we're going to, for those who want to understand more about why an element works, how an element works, what you can do with an element, how to test an element, I mean, all those things, well then, you're in the right place. If not, well, you know, do whatever comes natural, but at least subscribe and share us with your friends. Okay? Well, I appreciate that. Now I've got everybody's attention, and we already know what these are. I'm going to erase that in a few moments because we're going to use the whiteboard to describe things like electricity, just in general terms, basically. Now, for those of our friends who are across the water in the United Kingdom, or no matter where you are in the world, please understand that electricity works the same way. It doesn't matter where it's at, okay? So any formulas that we use are all universal. Electricity acts and reacts the same way no matter where it's at. The major difference is the electrical current and voltage that's provided to your end source. In the United States, and I start there, we have 240 volts, but basically that's what all electricity is designed and by law is provided to a residential area. 240 volts plus or minus 5%. Now that's why we have those different terminology. We say 110, 115, 120, 125 volts. Well, it all depends on where you're from and what you're accustomed to. But in general, it really is 120 volts. That's called RMS value. That's at a point in time. RMS means root mean square. And that's what a multimeter will test. The available voltage at that point in time. In the United Kingdom, as an example, in a lot of European countries, it's 220 volts. Oh, but they're wired exactly the same way. The only difference is the supplied voltage. Yes, the supplied voltage is just different. In Japan, it's the same as it is in the United States. In Canada, it's the same as it is in the United States. And portions of northern South America, it's the same. But it does vary differently across the world in different countries. The primary difference in all of those electrical voltages that are provided is really the difference between the hertz cycles. Okay? Normally in the United States, in those countries that recognize that system, it is 60 hertz, 60 cycles, positive, negatives, 60 times a second. Okay? Whereas in the European Union, it's 50 times a second. And really where that came from, just for those of you who are interested in history, Tesla, when he started working through three-phase, he determined that 60 cycles a second was the most efficient. And when the European Union and European countries started to develop their own and engineer their own power plants, 60 does not fit into the decimal system that easily. So they reverted to 50 because 50 works into the decimal. Oh, God, love it. You got to love it. I mean, that's the only reason why it's 50 hertz as opposed to 60 hertz. And now, what are the effects? You need to understand this up front. For us in the home distilling community, And for what we're doing, 60 hertz versus 50 hertz makes absolutely no difference whatsoever. It's a timing function, okay? So if you're working with small circuits based on a timing sequence, well then 60 cycles a second versus 50 cycles a second could make a difference. Okay? Now, let's talk about elements in themselves. Okay, all elements that we have here are available. You can get these at Home Depot, Lowe's, any of your hardware stores, and they range anywhere from $9 to about $15 a piece. So please, just be forewarned that yes, you can buy one for 70, 80 bucks online. And I'm not trying to put anybody out of business. I'm just trying to tell you what the facts are. These are single elements. And I have many here. I have 120 volt elements. I've got 240 volt elements. I've got 2,000 watt, 3,000, 4,500, 5,500 watt elements. They are all relatively inexpensive in themselves. They all have 2 screws on the bottom. All of them. Okay? And you'll find that that's pretty much universal for all elements. The only exception to that is elements that are made that are multiple elements on one hub. Okay? And then, oh, by the way, those are normally connected so that you still only have 2 places to put wires. So a heating element does not have a ground connection. The ground connection for your system, or if you're in the UK, earth, is an appliance ground. Okay? And when you use that, all you do is just attach it to the appliance. Oh, but the beauty behind these is that the 2 screws, it doesn't matter which screw you put a wire to. The element doesn't care. The element's going to work whether you put the white on one side and the black on the other, or the black on one side and the white on the other. It doesn't care. So that's the beauty behind these elements. Now, all these elements, and they come with gaskets, so they seal as soon as you screw them in. Standard in the United States is 1-inch NPT, National Pipe Thread. Okay? That's pretty much the standard. You'll notice that I have one here, and you'll see that I've got a black wire and a white wire, and because I've only got 2 screws. And in this particular case, I opted to just omit the green ground wire. It's a personal choice at that point. If I did use the ground, I would have just put a clamp on here and clamped it to the side of my appliance. So that's what we have. This happens to be a 3,000 watt element. I'm going to pull these out. You see, I've just got 2 wires on them. And now I use this. This is my 3-gallon Mighty Mini kettle. And I use this in order to just, I use this for testing. So when I build a PID, I'll run a test through it just to make sure that everything is working correctly. And I've got a 240 volt element, 3,000 watt, and I've got this 240 volt 20 amp plug on the end of it, just so that I can do that. So now, when an element itself, the way an element actually works is that electricity, of course, flows in one end and out the other. Well, in actuality, we all know that with AC current, it's flowing both directions, back and forth. But the beauty behind it is that there's a certain amount of resistance in each one of these elements that causes them to heat up. And that's what causes your mash, wash, water to get hot. Same thing in your water heater. It gets hot. When there is 0 resistance, as would be in this piece of wire, if you plug this into a socket, what would happen? Yes, first of all, you get a spark and it scared the hell out of you, but more than likely you'd blow a fuse or trip a breaker because there is no resistance. There's 0 resistance through this. Now, of course, we do know that there is a slight amount, but there's so little it's almost imperceptible, but it allows current to flow at max rate and it will trip the breaker. When you're using a heating element in particular, there's a resistance that's inherent in the material that's used that slows down that electrical current and causes the byproduct of that slowdown is heat. And that causes the heating element to get hot and heat up your mash, okay? That's how they work. So the first thing you need to know is that if you ever use a heating element, make sure that it is submerged. This one happens to be, I've got this about 2/3 full of water, and I use that again as my test bed. Never, 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 we call it dry fire. Never ever just plug a heating element into an electrical circuit and watch it get red hot, because it will, and then it will fail, okay? You'll damage it, destroy it. I accidentally did that with one of my 4,500 watt elements that I was testing. I use this sometimes, I'll just stick it in there, and I didn't have enough water to cover it, and of course this bottom end down here turned cherry red, and then guess what happens to it? I violated the integrity of this material, so now I can bend it real easy, and you don't want that to happen. As opposed to one that hasn't had that happen to, I didn't have that with this one. You can't bend it. It's really stiff, so that's the result. So please do not do that. Now, we've got 3 different plugs that we normally use, and this is in the United States, and believe it or not, in the United Kingdom it's really the same way, although the plugs are just made differently because your system is a little bit different. But just keep that in mind. This is a 120 volt plug. Oh no, this one is a 120 volt plug. And I know that because both of the blades are vertical. And I've got the grounding plug. Then I have a 250 volt, 250 volt, 20 amp plug. And I know that because this blade on the right hand side is horizontal. And the reason we do that, in the United States in particular, and in the countries that observe our system, the reason we do that is so that you don't accidentally plug this into one of these or this into one of these. That's really why it's done that way. And then we have the 30 amp plug. And the 30 amp twist lock plug, you can see that it's more of a substantial blades because it's carrying more current, and it's a twist lock plug, so it goes in, it twists, and it locks. That's why it's a 30 amp twist lock plug. And in every case here, I have a hot, and a ground. On the 20 amp 250 volt plug, I have a hot, and a ground. And on the 120 volt, I have a hot, a neutral, and a ground. Let me explain that just a little bit further. Okay, I've erased what we had before, and what I have here is I've got 3 lines. I've got 120 volts, a neutral, 120 volts, and a ground. Okay, and this is what's known as a 4-wire system, and it's a 4-wire circuit, and this is pretty much the system that we are accustomed to here. Now, believe it or not, everywhere else around the world, this configuration is exactly the same. The only exception is the voltage. Okay? In this particular case, we have 120 volts, neutral, 120, and ground. So if I attached, and I'm going to use this, this is what's beauty behind this. You see, there's they call it a potential difference. And that's just to make somebody sound smart. Okay? The voltage available, okay, between here and here is 120 volts. Yeah, simple as that. So if I have a fan sitting out here, oh yeah, I don't know, I'm just going to draw a crazy looking fan. And I run the hot wire here, and it's a 120 volt fan. And I run the neutral here. And of course, if you could, run the ground. I got a green somewhere. There it is, in my hand. And I run a ground down here, and that's for safety. That fan is going to operate, okay? That fan's going to work. It's going to spin. Now, but what I have down here is I also have another 120 volts between here and here. So, see here, this is where it gets really interesting, because the requirement here is just like it is in the UK. Our requirement is for energy providers to provide 240 volts split phase, 240 volts, plus or minus 5%. Okay? In the UK, they're required to provide 440 volts split phase, plus or minus 5%. So it works the same way. Now, if I was going to, let's say for instance, I was going to hook up a stove or an air conditioner or something an appliance that required a lot more energy to be efficient, and that's sitting right here, then I would run one wire from here. Now remember, this is the same circuit. I'd run one wire from here, because since these two are out of phase by 180 degrees, it's split phase. Then together they equal 240 volts. And of course, because I'll need that appliance ground, that goes right there, that thing will operate. Now that'll operate at the same time that the fan's operating. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you can run 240 volts off this circuit, and at the same time, you can draw 120 volts off that circuit at the same time. Okay? Now, someone's going to ask the question, well, George, what about the neutral in 240 volts? Well, when you have 120 volts and 120 volts that are on a split phase system, and remember, it doesn't matter, electricity doesn't care, it creates its own neutral. So the neutral is no longer necessary. The neutral is no longer necessary when you are using 240 volts on a split phase system. Now the same is true in countries that have 440. The only difference would be these figures. This would be 220 and this would be 220. And then that would turn this into 440. But you see, it's still the same. I do know that in particular, that in the European Union, that they don't call this ground. This is not ground. They call this earth. In a lot of circles, okay? So that's how electricity actually works. And it is, believe it or not, that simple. So that should arm you with enough information that even if you're around the house and something should stop working, you can kind of go to the source. You know how to identify what is supposed to be happening, and you can wire up your own. Hell, I've got videos to show you how to wire up your own PID. They work here, they work in India, they work in Japan, it works in Russia. It doesn't matter where it's at. Electricity is all the same. I hope that I have uncovered that so far. Now, the last but not least, what we want to do, I want to demonstrate something for you, and I want to demonstrate another method of determining the wattage of, because we know that to determine the wattage of an element itself, you just look on the side of it and it's written. This one says 240 volts and it says 3,000 watts. But if it's encased, like this one is encased, and you forgot to write it on the outside, and you got a few of them you got them mixed up, you want to know what is the wattage of this element without uncasing it. Or if you want to test the element to make sure that it's working, then it's easy to do. It's real simple. Find yourself a multimeter and put it on ohms. Ohms is the measurement of resistance. Okay, all it measures is how much resistance is there between this point and this point if an electrical current is passed through that. That's all it measures. It places a small electrical current and it determines, your multimeter measures and determines what is the resistance of it getting from here to here. That's what it does. So we're going to place this on the end of, I know this is a 240 volt element, so I'm not even going to look at it right now. Let me grab another one I'm not going to look at the numbers on it, but I'm just going to put these on here and put them on the two screws, and then I'm going to watch my meter. And my meter is measuring, and it says it is 13.5 ohms. So right now I have 13.5, this is a symbol for ohms, ohms of resistance, okay? The formula is really simple. Oh gosh, it's the voltage squared divided by the resistance. That's this number here. I already know that it's 240 volts. Watch this. Now this is cold because, of course, resistance changes whether it's hot or cold. Not drastically, but you'll get different readings. So I got 240 volts squared. That equals, this equals 57,600, and I divide that by 13.5, and that equals, oh shoot, let me put that back in. 57,600 divided by 13.5 equals 4,266.666 watts. That's my wattage. Let me get this out of the way. That's my wattage. So 4,260. This has got to be a 4,500 watt element. And let me look at it. Whoop, turn it over. Yep, there it is. 240 volts, 4,500 watts. So if you ever want to find out whether your element has failed or you have an issue with your element, all you've got to do is use your multimeter and check the resistance on it, and then do the quick math problem, and it'll tell you whether your element has failed or not. Now, we are on. Now, the very, very last point I want to make is that if you have a 120 volt, 2,000 watt element, please do not plug that into 240 volts. Okay? Same thing if you have a 220 volt element, don't plug that into 440 volts. Because what will happen to it? You will destroy it. If you have a 240 volt element, you can plug that into 120 volts because you're not exceeding the voltage that it's rated for. But just keep in mind that you're only going to receive 25% of its available wattage. Yes, there's a math problem for that too, but I don't want to bore you with it, but understand that, okay? So a 3,000 watt element actually ends up, if you connect a 240 volt 3,000 watt element on 120 volts, you now have a 750 watt element. Kind of like begs the question, I mean, why don't you just use the 2,000 watt 120 volt, you know? And the same thing holds true for if it's a 440 volt element, you could plug it into 220 volts, but you're only going to get 25% of its rated value. I hope that clears all of that up for you. And in the meantime, of course, as always, we say, yes, happy distilling.